All right, welcome everyone. This is we've got a nice group here today. We're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, Sedevacantism. It's going to be hopefully a productive kind of conversation. It'll be casual, it'll be fun. Not just making fun of them. People do a lot of that, probably enough. And I'm pointing at myself when I say that. We're going to talk a little bit more about the actual groups that make up Sedevacantism and just any of our thoughts, any of our experiences with it. So we have Braden, the catechumen, and we have Christian, the Canterbury Catholic. You guys want to say anything, or just want to jump in?
Yo, everyone subscribe to Seth's channel and everyone go watch the Inquisition episode that he posted
Still
because
writing
it's the
that.
best video on the internet.
Oh
That
yeah.
one, that one like went up to 26,000 views, and then it hasn't like for the
I
last 2 weeks. I
know.
don't think anyone's watched it.
Gosh, the feds, dude, they blocked it. They blocked it
Yeah.
everywhere. We need to get the circulation going.
The week that video was posted, I played a game with myself to see like which of my like Catholic quasi celebrity friends would text me that. And the list was pretty astounding. It was pretty
Really?
great. Like the rounds it made from like certain people associated with certain internet bishops to, certain other podcasts. It was pretty great.
Wow, that's fascinating. And
Yeah.
wow, that's cool.
So what
Yeah,
you're saying is Pope Francis texted you personally and was
Yeah,
like, "Hey,
actually, yeah, yeah.
exactly.
I'm in his fave fives.
oh
There
yeah,
you
grant a plenary indulgence for that video,
I'm
as long as you use the discount code at the end."
there you go.
just a Jesuit operative, guys.
There you go. Man, there's so many comments in there about people just thinking I was really rude to Trent. And they're like, "Who's this interviewer?"
Dude.
So
No, the
fun.
pins
Every
of
time I get a
shame.
new
It
one, I
kind of
pin it.
changed. It changed every time because
Great.
there's one more like outlandish than the other. Like every day, it was just kind of funny.
So I think what would be cool is to go through what I think is really interesting about Sedevacantism is that there are so many different subgroups within it. It's not really a unified movement by any means. They all obviously share in common that they think there hasn't been a pope since 1958. That's like the one thing they share in common, I guess. But yeah, I thought it'd be cool to kind of go through them, and some of us know more about certain groups than others. We can kind of chime in as we need to. But probably the first group we should talk about is actually two groups, which are the SSPV and the CMRI. They're probably the two most recognizable groups because they actually have priests and bishops. I think most of them trace their lineage to Lefebvre, but maybe not all. Christian, you know way more about this. If you want to clarify anything I just said that was wrong.
Yeah, so I'll just start off by saying I myself have never been a sedevacantist. As I think is the case with a lot of guys, when I first discovered them, they kind of grabbed my attention because
Mm-hmm.
suddenly they were saying things that kind of went against the grain. And I looked into them a lot and I studied them a lot, and sometimes I still listen to some of their rhetoric, but I never made the leap because their arguments were just so all over the place and incredibly subjective. And that kind of comes back to the theme of this discussion, is the fact that their ecclesiology is kind of Protestant in nature. Um, so I just wanted to put that out there. So
Yeah.
I do know a lot, but I can't claim the badge of having ever been a
Oh,
sede.
sure. Yeah.
So the SSPV and the CMRI, these are two different organizations. I'll start with the CMRI. Stands for, in Latin, it's congregate. I don't know what it is. In Latin, it basically means the Congregation of Mary, Immaculate Queen. In Latin, that renders out to something slightly different. Hence the letter CMRI. Um, but basically, it started off initially as kind of like a rosary confraternity thing. It was a small group centered around promoting devotion to Our Lady of Fatima. And it was started by this guy named Francis Schuchart, who was just kind of this very, I guess you could say, charismatic guy. He just talked a lot and drew all these conclusions in terms of what was happening after the council. And eventually it went down this rabbit hole. He started getting followers and he was consecrated a bishop. I believe it was actually an old Catholic bishop who had
Okay.
valid orders. Um, a lot of people connect him to people like Archbishop Tuck, who we'll talk about later, I'm sure.
Hmm.
But he actually came from a whole different line.
Okay. Wow.
And he was eventually kicked out because of sexual allegations. And the CMRI by this point had evolved into basically a religious order that had gone off the rails. By the way, they were never officially recognized or given canonical mission by Rome. They were always doing their own thing. This was completely lay led. And when Schuckardt was ordained and consecrated, he started ordaining priests, um, kind of WYSIWYG without Rome's approval. Um, Eventually, he gets kicked out, and they get another bishop, Bishop Carmona. This is a Mexican bishop who was consecrated by Archbishop Tuck. Um, to consecrate one of their priests. At the time, he was known as Father Tarsicius, and then when he was consecrated a bishop, he went back to his Christian name, Bishop Mark Pivarunas, and
Hmm.
he's the bishop of the CMRI. As far as I know, he's the only bishop of the CMRI.
Okay.
Um, but he's been leading them for quite some time, and they operate a seminary in Omaha, and they have a huge compound that they bought from the Jesuits in Washington State somewhere.
Hmm.
Now the SSPV, this is, and if I talk too long, please just tell me, because these two organizations have crazy histories, and
Yeah.
the SSPV is tied to some of the other organizations we'll talk about. The SSPV stands for Society of St. Pius V. The
And they broke
SSPV,
out from the SSPX, right? Directly.
correct, yeah. So the SSPV was established by initially 9 and then eventually 12 priests, um, who either left or were, again, depending on who you ask, excuse me, were expelled from the SSPX by Lefebvre. Um, some of these priests, I don't off the top of my head know the names of all of them, but there's some big names in the kind of American stratosphere. Um, At the time, Father Sanborn, Father Donald Sanborn, Father Anthony Cicada, Father Daniel Dolan, Father William Jenkins, and yeah, those are kind of the four kind of
Hmm.
main guys. And a lot of people think that they were kicked out because of the Sedevacante issue. It actually wasn't that. Archbishop Lefebvre, much to the chagrin of a lot of SSPX people today, um, while it's accurate to say he himself never proclaimed sedevacante, he certainly permitted it within the
Hmm.
SSPX. Um, Now, to varying degrees, depending on what tensions, how tense things were with Rome, he would be a little bit more strict about it. If he was more angry with Rome, he would be loose about it. But even today, SSPX does have a certain kind of don't ask, don't tell policy when it comes to sedevacantism amongst their clergy. So the SSPV, like I said, 12 priests that were expelled or left the SSPX. Um, and they kind of fell apart pretty quickly because their bylaws were very loose. They didn't have a hierarchy amongst the clergy, it was more democratic. And each cleric kind of wanted to do their own thing. And they still exist to this day, but it's kind of a shadow of what it once was. Similarly to the CMRI, it's very cultish. They operate their own seminary. They have, I think, two bishops. Their founding bishop, not founding bishop, their kind of head bishop, Bishop Clarence Kelly, actually recently died, but no one knew that he was sick. It just kind of announced one day that he was dead. And even the circumstances within which he was consecrated a bishop are kind of they're kind of fishy,
Hmm.
suspect to say the least. We can get into that later if you'd like, but
Well, I
yeah,
think it's interesting because the SSPV and the CMRI, I think theologically they're pretty much in agreement, but one group has doubts about the validity of the other group's orders, right?
yeah. So the SSPV, I'm not sure how they feel against the CMRI, but I will say the SSPV, in terms of the American um, stratosphere is the best word to use for that. They wholeheartedly kind of champion the crusade against the validity of any holy orders stemming from Archbishop Pierre Martin Notingtook. They completely reject them and say they're completely invalid. And in fact, this was a big sticking point that eventually led to a lot of SSPV priests leaving, It is not the primary reason why they left, but it was a big kind of builder of tension. Was people arguing whether or not they could do anything, they could have anything to do with bishops who derive their orders from Archbishop Tuck.
Mhm.
And at the time, this was a serious issue because they had a seminary, but they had no bishop at the time. And this was back in the 80s. Um, and so it was a real problem for them to kind of work through that. And that still is a problem for them today. CMRI, I think, accepts Archbishop Tuck's consecrations and clergy that stem from him. But like I said, they're very cultish in terms of
Mhm.
who CMRI people can interact with, what they can do online, whether or not they can read certain stuff. It's again, it's
Yeah.
very bizarre.
Yeah. And then you mentioned Sanborn. And I almost forgot that he's not part of either of these groups anymore, right? He has his own the
No,
IC
so
RCI or something.
yeah, so Father Sanborn leaves the SSPV
Okay.
over um, not necessarily doctrinal issues, over more governance issues. There was a lot of secrecy going on, people being ordained without other people being told, and he just didn't want to be part of it. So he eventually goes rogue, and then in 20, I want to say in like 2016, he officially establishes what's called the RCI, which is the Roman Catholic Institute, and it's essentially what the SSPV wanted to be. It's an association of priests with constitutions and bylaws, all of which you can read online, and they stem from theological positions, liturgical directories, um, so on and so forth. And he is the superior of the order, and they operate a seminary, they operate multiple chapels and mass centers. um, they also push certain theological positions which are again unsavory to other groups within the Tratosphere. So
Mhm.
it is its own thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I should have asked you this earlier, Braden, but as a somewhat recent convert, like, when did you first hear about all this, and like, what are your thoughts right now about?
Dude, yeah. So first of all, super fascinating history, and I haven't heard of a lot of these different niche groups, but when we started this, it's just like there's all these different groups that have like a loose affiliation with each other that aren't technically the same group or in
Mhm.
communion with each other or whatever, but they're all grouped in to this one category based off of their opposition to the Catholic Church. What does that
Mhm.
sound like? Well, it sounds
Right.
like Protestantism.
Yeah.
It sounds like Protestantism. So it seems like, Christian's never been a Sedevacantist. Seth, you've never been a Sedevacantist. So as a former Protestant, I'm like the closest to Sedevacantism, right? I have the most experience. Okay, but yeah, when I was discerning, you have the whole range of like, okay, you got the mad rad trad, and then you got the other like super far on the other side, and then you have all these different groups that have like some sort of a voice online, and it can be super confusing when you're looking into the Catholic Church to even recognize that, oh, this person who's claiming to be a Catholic, who isn't in communion with Rome, who doesn't think that Pope Francis is really the Pope,
Mhm.
that they're not representative of the Catholic tradition, right? And so like when you're discerning, it can be very hard to kind of weed through, okay, these people are claiming to be Catholic, but they don't think the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church. They think they're the
Mhm.
Catholic Church. So it's like you have this like quasi Donatist like
Mhm.
movement where, if you're not familiar with the Donatists, they believe that their order, their movement, their church in North Africa was the only valid church because of their holiness. Okay, and so
Mhm.
the administration of their sacraments were the only valid sacraments because everyone else was tainted by
Mhm.
unholy things, right? And so they would dispute the validity of certain bishops and priests and all these people who had valid holy orders and who were able to validly administer the sacraments. They just questioned whether their sacraments were valid, right? And so to me, digging into that history was gave me the ability to start kind of recognizing it. But no, definitely from coming from a low church Baptist background, like, what the heck? What's happening? You don't know. Like, you kind of think Sedevacantists groups are like the Knights of Columbus or something, and they just have some weird fringe group, weird fringe ideas, but they're Catholic, right? So yeah, you don't understand how to parse between it. So it can be very it can be very scandalizing, I suppose, is stumbling block these groups. Along with people who are in communion with Rome, who kind of push you towards those groups, right? And so, very definitely confusing for people, especially I know right now, who are interested in the Catholic Church. Like, what about these guys? Is this whole thing just a big conspiracy, and Pope Francis not a true pope, and just everyone thinks he's the true pope, but he's not, right? Which of these niche groups should I join? And it's very confusing, and it's still, after being in the church for a few years and just like going through all the theology and stuff, it's still hard to parse out. It's still hard to kind of identify where these groups go wrong, at least in their ecclesiology, their theology. But one thing's for certain: if you're not in communion with Rome, that's the definition of schism, and it always has been, right? It doesn't matter if you're a patriarch or a bishop or a priest or a layperson. If you're not in communion with Rome, you're not in communion with the Catholic Church. So you're not a Catholic, right? And so that's the line that we need to be able to draw. And so the Protestants will say, will dispute that, say, no, Rome has gone off the rails. Rome, if you're in communion with Rome, you're not actually part of the Catholic Church, which is identified as this invisible body with right preaching and right administration of the sacraments. Well, Sedevacantists will say, well, yeah, you do have to be in communion with Rome, but no one's Rome, so to say. The bishopric of Rome is vacant. So it's like, it's that same
you have to
sort
be
of
in
logic
union
as the
with
Protestants.
the teachings of the church is kind of
Right. It's like and the teachings of the church is filtered through their group, their movement, right? So like Protestants, that sort of ecclesiological error creeps in. And so instead of saying, oh, you don't really need communion with Rome, it's like, well, you do, but like functionally that doesn't matter right now.
Yeah. Sedevacantists really hate when you call them Protestant, and I think we're not saying your theology is Protestant. We're saying your ecclesiology is Protestant, right? It's
right.
And it's kind of on two levels. One is, there's no church or point. So like if you ask them like, where's the church today? Where's the visible church? They'll say, oh, it's just a group of all those who believe the true faith. It's like, isn't that what Protestants say the church is? Right. They might throw in, oh, you have to be baptized and believe in the true faith. And it's like, okay, you're adding in baptism. That's great, but it's fundamentally the same thing. And then as we're going to get through, there's all these other groups. They're all disagreeing with each other. At the end of the day, is it just you're just basing it off your own intellect and ability to figure out the most consistent version of your reading of encyclicals and councils?
It's not like this is just some weird, oh, you guys are just being cringe and nitpicky. It's like, this has like serious implications. Should I go to the Novus Ordo Mass and receive the sacraments there? Are those sacraments valid? Or should I stay home and pray your rosary, and make sure it's the full rosary, and make sure you don't pray the luminous mysteries. That's for sure. That's heresy for some reason, even though they coexisted at the same time. The rosary started picking up. Anyways, it's just like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So all in all, it's like, it's so wish-washy and confusing, not because the Catholic Church is confusing, but because of these people are obfuscating and saying, well, look at this, super old encyclical over here, which, like, I'm not disputing the validity of papal bulls and encyclicals. Obviously, I'm a Catholic. But it's like, their just niche interpretation of this automatically means all these popes are just invalid, and then, like, they tell you what to do. They give you their 5-step list of what to do and what not to do. And it's just like, it's a horrible I don't know, it's a horrible place to be in because it's like it's you versus the world without any foreseen way of resolving it unless you submit to what's his face, Pope Michael II or Boniface X or
Yeah, we'll
something.
we'll
Or
get to those groups for sure.
Oh yeah, we will.
I think there was a guy from Oklahoma, like Oklahoma City or something
Like,
like that, who called himself the Pope. It was funny. My Lutheran friend showed me that whenever I was considering the converting to the Catholic Church. But
Yeah, it is interesting. You know, you pointed out the whole Donatus thing. I found in my intake and my slothing through kind of Sedevacantists literature and media that Donatism is a really big problem that they all struggle with to one degree or another, and not necessarily in relation to the Catholic Church, but in relation to each other. Um, this whole there's a prevailing issue, and part of the reason why Sedevacantism is not monolithic in terms of how it is uh, kind of governed, right? There's not a Sedevacantist Catholic Church where they're all in communion with each other, but also it's not monolithic in terms of its theology. You know, you would think that if the position is, well, we are Catholics, the guy in white sitting in Rome right now is not a Catholic because of XYZ heresy, and neither was his predecessor or his predecessor, or so on and so forth. And it all stems back to this ecumenical council, which is really not a council because it's a false council according to them. Well, we're just going to ignore all that, keep doing what we're doing until the church figures it out. You'd
mhm,
think it would be pretty simple. Like the guardrails of orthodoxy in terms of Catholicism are pretty pretty solid. I mean, if you stay within those guardrails, you more or less should all fall within the same kind of. It shouldn't be so much of a spectrum. But what you find is it's so incredibly varied. I mean, you have you have most set of a contest groups claiming that the Pope is, Pope Francis is not the Pope, but his election was valid, and so he has the opportunity to become Pope if he were to renounce the heresies of Vatican II.
mm,
You have other set of accounts saying that no, that's completely false, and that those two schools are really kind of battling it out right now, in particularly in North America.
yeah,
But then you have other set of accounts who are saying, Sedevacantists bishop saying, I am purely a sacrament dispenser, right? It is my job to keep the priesthood chugging along because what the guys are doing, what the diocesan bishop is doing in downtown Chancery is heresy and invalid. And the guy, the guys he's laying his hands on are not actually priests. So it's up to me to do it.
mhm,
And that's it. I don't have one set of a contest bishop once said, I don't have any more jurisdiction to govern the church or the laity than a garbage man, right? But then you also have other Sedevacanist bishops, namely in South and Central America, saying, no, we have jurisdiction, we have authority by virtue of our episcopal consecrations
mhm,
to bind and loose the laity, even in the absence of or even in the vacancy of the Petrine See. And those are two really big different interpretations of
mhm,
Sedevacantism. And so you have all these different groups battling it out, not just against the modern heretic, or at least what they consider to be the modern heretics, but
mhm.
amongst themselves. And I mean, there's almost no unity, and it really kind of damns their position.
Yeah.
yeah,
And this goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago because I forgot to mention that Donald Sanborn. So he's RCI. He's the main proponent of what you were just talking about, the thesis they call it about the Pope is materially the Pope but not formally the Pope. And it seems like it kind of in practice it's not very different.
Yeah.
But do these groups like consider each other to be heretics, or like is this just kind of a minor point of disagreement for them?
So since you brought it up, the RCI Bishop Donald Sanborn is the biggest proponent of this theological position called the Thesis of Cassisiacum. generally just referred to as the thesis because people can't pronounce that second word.
That's why I did it.
Right. um, so the thesis basically postulates that the post-conciliar popes are invalid. However, their election was valid. In other words, the College of Cardinals, the only thing to be a cardinal, it's not an additional sacrament. It's not an additional level to holy orders, right? It's just a designation to elect, which is why in the past you could be a layman and you could be a cardinal. You could even be you don't even have to be a bishop to be a
Mhm.
cardinal. Most famously, St. John Henry Newman was not, he was a cardinal. He was made a cardinal by Leo the 13th, I believe, but he was not a bishop. He was just a priest. And that's because all you got to do is to elect someone. You don't actually have to be, it's not a level of holy orders.
Mhm.
So the thesis postulates that um, while a heretic cannot be pope, a heretic can designate who the pope will be. In other words, being a heretic does not remove the position of being a cardinal. And so all of these conclaves, the conclave that elected John the 23rd, St. John the 23rd, St. Paul the 6th, John Paul the 1st, John Paul the 2nd, Benedict the 16th, and now Pope Francis, have all been valid conclaves. However, the man was unable to accept the election and therefore take on the charism of the papacy because he had an impediment to that acceptance, namely heresy,
Mhm.
right? And so the thesis of Cassisiacum states that if the man in white at any given moment were to renounce the heresy of Vatican II, humanism, generally modernism is kind of the best blanket term to apply to it, he would in that instance become pope immediately. Now, the problem that most people have is that that's incredibly subjective. And to his credit, Bishop Donald Sanborn acknowledges that it's incredibly subjective, right? If you ask him what that repudiation of heresy looks like, he says that, and these are his words, that you would have to take the documents of Vatican II and burn them in St. Peter's Square and excommunicate practically everyone, and kind of
Mhm.
start from fresh. Um,
Do with Exurge Domine again?
right. Right, back to this whole the whole theme of sedevacantism and
Yeah.
Protestantism really being the same thing. This theological position, which was initially kind of formulated by Bishop Gerard de Laurier. Gerard de Laurier was a Dominican theologian. Eventually he taught, at Econ, Switzerland, briefly, and then I don't know if he left or if he was expelled from the faculty, but he eventually left and was consecrated a bishop directly from Archbishop Took. And he formulated this thesis with the intention of trying to formulate a theologically consistent and cohesive way that would explain how the church got into this mess and how the church would get out of this mess.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's really the whole point of the thesis. It wasn't formed in a vacuum. There was a real intention, which I can respect, because I mean, if you're going to hold that the see is vacant and that an
Or at least giving a
ecumenical
solution. Yeah.
right, exactly, which the two kind of main factions in sedevacantism, particularly American sedevacantism, is you have the thesis group and then you have totalism. Totalism sedevacantism simply says we don't know how this is going to work. Some people have claimed, I don't know where they get this, but some people have claimed that Saints Peter and Paul will appear in the heavens and designate the new
Yeah.
pope,
Right.
which is like,
Huh.
where are you getting that?
Yeah.
Um, it's just bizarre.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a rundown of the
Yeah.
thesis, and it is a real contentious point in the United States. In Europe, it's a little bit more well accepted. There's a Sedevacantist group in Europe called the IMBC, the Institute of Our Lady of Good Counsel, that they promote the thesis over there, and it's a
Mhm.
little bit more well spread. But in the U.S., people get the debates get real ugly against thesis sedes and
Yeah,
totalist sedes. I'll put it
gotcha.
that way.
And let's keep going here because we're still. So I kind of broke this up into like 6 or 7
Hmm.
groups, and this is by far the biggest one. The other ones are more interesting, but I guess one more point to bring up because this is interesting because so I have a family member who lives near Cincinnati, which is where one of the main SSPV chapels are, and I remember like driving by and I'm like, oh, it's Catholic Church, and then like I looked it up. I'm like, oh, SSPV, okay, interesting. And then later on, I went and I knew about Father Chicata just in passing, and I was like, wait, isn't his chapel? I thought it was the same chapel because I'm like Cincinnati. Like, what are the odds? No, there are two Sedevacantists, different groups in the same city, and they have their own beef with each other, which is interesting. um,
Cincinnati is kind of like Sedevacantist mecca.
yeah.
It's crazy. Ohio in general has a lot of groups represented there, but I think in Cincinnati you have SSPV, you have CMRI, you have Independent Chapel, St. Gertrude the Great, you have SSPX, you have FSSP, who obviously are not
Yeah.
sedes, but you have everything in Cincinnati. It's kind of crazy. Yeah.
I've always thought. I wonder at what the diocesan Latin mass is like there because you probably weeded out all the crazies and maybe it's
Yeah.
actually just, like, really solid people who like the Latin mass. I don't know if that's true or not, but it might be. Um, but yeah, Father Cicada and Bishop Dolan, they initially split off from the SSPX and then they split off from the SSPV. Was that also over just they wanted more structure?
Yeah, so they left from the SSPV before Father Sanborn, the
Okay.
then Father Sanborn, but for the essentially for the same reason. There was a lot of secrecy. There was a big cult of personality
Hmm.
centered around Father Clarence Kelly, who was eventually consecrated a bishop and led them. So they left and they kind of worked together just for a while, and then when Sanborn left, he got back in touch with them and they kind of operated kind of in concert together, but not necessarily
Hmm.
with the same apostolate. Um, Father Cicada was on the faculty of Bishop Sanborn Seminary for a long time. I actually got to meet. So Bishop Sanborn Seminary was in Brooksville, Florida, which is about 50 minutes west of me. And I I've driven by it. I never actually went there. I obviously never went to mass there, but I've seen it from afar.
Hmm.
But because of the proximity, oftentimes I would see Bishop Sanborn or some of his clergy like at the airport when I'm traveling. And I actually met Father Cicada. I sat with him on a plane
Oh wow.
coming. I was actually in Cincy coming home, and he was on that flight. So I actually sat with him and talked with him.
Oh wow.
Super nice
What was
guy.
that like?
He
How long
was
of a
really
flight was
nice.
it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, Father
Yeah.
Chicada had a he passed away in 2020. He had a not a history, but I guess he was known for being really witty and really funny, and he actually was really funny. He had a really good sense of humor, and he was pretty smart. He was well versed in canon law. He was a musician like myself, so we kind of bonded over that. Um, but it was a nice conversation. He was again super cordial. He heard all my arguments. I actually presented an argument that he had never really dealt with before, so I felt proud
Ooh,
about
okay.
that.
Nice.
um, but yeah, so Sanborn and Chicada worked together in the faculty of the seminary, and but Chicada's kind of home base was in Cincinnati
Gotcha.
with Saint Gertrude the Great chapel with Bishop Dolan.
Gotcha. Oh, real quick, I just remembered. I don't know if you guys ever seen this. It's hard to find. I have it saved so I can share it. But there was a Catholic Answers Live segment where Father Cicada calls in with Tim Staples. It was like super cordial. Like they were both like,
Yeah,
yeah, he seems really nice. Like it wasn't like he was trying to ambush them or anything. But they had like
you know
this
I
20-minute
I didn't know
conversation, and
that.
like I thought it went really well. Like they were both making their points, and like Tim Staples, like was I think he did a really good job. Like just kind of
I
giving our side
vaguely
of it.
remember that. I think
Yeah.
I may have seen that before. I vaguely remember it. Yeah, Chicada again, super witty, always known for having a good sense of humor, but being super cordial about it.
Hmm.
He tended to be more he tended to be more aggressive with other Sedevacantist groups like
Sure.
CMRI and SSPV people. But when it came to what they refer to, Catholics in communion with Rome as Novus Ordo Catholics.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
with Novus Ordo Catholics, he tended to be pretty cordial. Last thing, Father Chicada, a lot of his material is online. He was kind of the first kind of
Mhm.
internet Sede priest. He taught himself how to make videos. He was writing articles forever. He wrote a book. Actually, I have the book.
Oh, wow.
He gave it to me, so I didn't give them any money, but he did
Did he
give it to
sign it?
me. No, I didn't think about that, but no. It's called Work of Human Hands: A Theological Critique of the Mass of Paul VI. It basically, he goes through the entire new mass, and his conclusion is that it's an invalid mass. Go figure.
Mhm.
Would they say, the Novus Ordo is invalid in the sense that when consecration occurs, like it's not actually the Eucharist? Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons why. Okay, so I'm really not recommending this book, because don't give these people money. But again, I only have this book because the author handed it to me. Um, for all I know, this could be a second class relic. But anyways, but anyways, basically he goes through this whole book, and he goes from the start of the mass to the end of the mass, and he goes through the different parts: the orations, the translations, the history of the Eucharistic prayers, which are a very contentious point. He even goes through the history of like the anaphras. Um, and his conclusion is that it is an invalid rite primarily for a handful of reasons. But to answer your question, I'll give you two primary reasons. One, he makes the argument that the translation in the initial English form of the Mass of Paul VI was invalid because they changed the words of consecration from pro multis, for many, to pro omnibus, for all, but only in English. So if you did the Novus Ordo in Latin, it would say pro multis, right? But in the English translation, they changed it to for all. And I know you're a newer Catholic. Seth, are you a cradle Catholic?
Yeah, so I grew
So,
up hearing "For You and
right.
For All" for the
So
longest time, yeah.
right. You remember, you've given up for you and for all. You also remember, and also with you.
Yeah.
Um, but that was one sticking point, that because they changed that one word, that it completely theologically throws the whole thing out of whack, and therefore it is invalid. Another argument was that, and this one, uh, I think you can kind of make an argument for the first point, even though Aquinas says that you actually refutes that directly. But this next one I think is ridiculous. At the beginning of every missal, there's this thing called the germ, the general instruction of the Roman Missal, and it provides certain kind of rubrical principles for the liturgy, and it breaks it off into sections. And at the beginning, it basically says, the celebration of the Lord's Supper, in parentheses, commonly called the Mass. He makes the argument that now that we are referring to this service as the Lord's Supper and not as a Mass, as a sacrifice, you have fundamentally changed the intention of the celebrant, and therefore it cannot be a valid Eucharist. Um, he also, another point to that end, states that I think also in the general instruction, it refers to the words of consecration as the institution narrative. And he says referring to this as just a narrative is insufficient because that suggests it's just like telling a story. Similar to, I think, the Christmas Vigil. Sorry, not the Christmas Vigil. On Holy Thursday, one of the readings, I believe, is the actual the Last Supper. And when the priest or whoever the deacon is reading that, he is not doing so with the intention of confecting the Eucharist because it's a narrative, right? But when the priest does so later, when he says the words of Christ later in the liturgy, he does so with the intention of confecting the Eucharist, and that is not a narrative. And so to refer to it as a narrative in the general instruction invalidates the whole liturgy, which I think is patently absurd,
Right.
frankly. But whatever,
Yeah.
whatever.
Fun
Well, thank you
stuff.
very much for that clarification. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was like, okay, invalid in what sense? And then, yeah, the just go back to the Donatist.
Yeah.
But I suppose this isn't the same logic, obviously, as the
Mhm.
Donatists would use, but just
Well, the
interesting.
problem too is if you're going to be so fast and loose with how easy it is to invalidate the mass at that point, I point one thing that Sedevacantists always, and this is a big point, an argument point for me that I don't think enough people are making against Sedes, is that they live in this bubble where to them the Catholic Church is the Western Church. There's nothing outside of Rome, right? You might have a Dominican rite, you might have an Ambrosian rite or a Mozarabic rite or a Gallic rite, but anything east of Italy doesn't exist. So Constantinople, the Slavic countries, the Syriac countries who are even older, the African church, the African countries and the church in Africa, which again vastly, predate the Roman church, practically don't exist. And so when you point to certain traditions within those churches that completely destroy their argument, um, they don't really have a good argument for them. And if they were to acknowledge that argument, they would realize that if you're going to say that the Syriac church, which for a period of time, and I think in some instances still does not, have this exact words of institutions in their liturgy, in their form of the divine liturgy, if you're going to say that's invalid, well, you're going to say that they had an invalid rite since like the second century, and
Mhm.
that the church up until now has just failed to acknowledge that and has just allowed an arm of the church to be completely devoid of the sacraments. And that doesn't sound like a church that has
Mhm.
the assistance of the Holy Ghost. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I said, a lot of his stuff is online. Even now, to this day, even though he's been dead for a little bit more than 4 years now, um, he is still kind of the most accessible Sede priest because
Mhm.
he's
Yeah.
he's talked about everything. I mean, you look him up on YouTube and there's hours and hours of him talking, and he's pretty easy to listen to, and so it kind of lulls you into a false sense of security. Um, but yeah, you got to be careful because again, he even someone who was as intelligent and learned as he was, and articulate, he nonetheless makes the same errors that are pretty glaring when
Mhm.
it comes to the wider Sedevacantist argument.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So that pretty much sums up all of the, I guess, the groups that we could say at least can kind of trace their origins back to Rome. Oh, one other thing I want to add: so Father Jenkins is the other. He's the SSPV guy, right? I remember seeing
Hmm.
it must have been like in the '90s or something, a debate between the two of them. I think it was over something really trivial, like on what, like, can you deny
Oh,
communion
it
to
was,
the other
yeah,
group?
yeah, yeah.
And
It
like,
was yep. I know exactly it's that one debate that's broken up into like 20
yeah,
videos. Yeah,
back
I
when
know
YouTube
exactly
only
what you're
let you
talking
for
about.
like 10-minute
Yeah,
maximum, so it was like,
yeah,
but it was
yeah.
over like one group says you can deny communion for the other
Hmm.
group, and one said it was fine. And it was
Yeah,
just like, I remember seeing that. That was just one of the more eye-opening things. So just like these two guys like are basically the same, and they're arguing over this,
yep.
and there's no one that can really settle it because they don't have a authority to go to ask who's right about this.
Let's go to the Bible.
Right, the Bible. The a set of economists will say, well, we have tradition, similar to the Orthodox argument. Well, we have
Mhm,
holy tradition. Well, the problem is they all interpret holy tradition and canon law and all these various things that are supposed to be tools in their wheelhouse completely differently. I mean, to the end, to your point, with that debate, they were debating, you know, is anyone associated with Archbishop Tuck and his clergy and or not even his clergy, but people who derive their orders from Tuck, either directly or indirectly, are they Catholics? In other words, can they, are they in good standing? And SSPV ardently says no. Father Chicago was saying that, yeah, you can. That, to say that you can't is, to accuse us of being sacramentally infected is the heresy of Donatism, and he's right in that matter. But the point is, like you said, they can't
mhm.
even agree with each other.
All right, shall we move on to the Diamond Brothers? These are there's sort of an umbrella here of what people commonly call Feniites, and that's kind of a pejorative because nobody likes that term. Um, but the main difference between the Diamonds and these groups we've already talked about is that the Diamonds do not believe in baptism of desire or baptism of blood, and they believe that those are both heresies to hold to. So they basically say all of these groups we just talked about, because all of the priests, as far as I know, the priests and the bishops of these groups all accept those at least as ideas. Whether how frequently it happens or whatever is up for debate. But the fact that they believe these makes them heretics, and we should not approach them for the sacraments because of that. Is the general idea, um, and that's the reason why they don't go to mass. It's not because they don't think you can go to mass. It's just that they believe 99.9% of priests are heretics. um, and there's so much more that can be said about the diamonds, but yeah, you guys have any run-ins with them or anything like
N-
that? Did you meet the diamonds on
No,
a plane at any point?
no, I can't say I'm at the Diamond Brothers, but man, I would love to.
Mhm.
I actually don't know too much about the Diamond Brothers because, and it's Most Holy Family, right?
Most Holy
Monastery.
Family
Yeah,
Monastery, yeah.
yeah. Because I mean, I'm trying to be as charitable as I can, but
Mhm,
no one takes them seriously. I mean, they very outright reject a clearly defined dogma of the church, and so
mhm,
to hold to the position of Leonard Feeney is, I mean, it kind of takes them out of the running of
mhm,
uh, being taken seriously. They're also pretty cultish. I mean, even more so, I would say, than CMRI and the Society of St. Pius V.
mhm.
So that's kind of all I have to say
Yeah.
about them.
Well, what's interesting is, and I agree that in the grand scheme of things, nobody takes them seriously. But what's interesting is if you hear their arguments, they're internally consistent. They're saying, look at this papal statement that says baptism is necessary and doesn't give any exceptions. Look at this papal bull. Look at this, what this pope said, what this saint said. Oh, when this saint talked about it, he wasn't, he wasn't the pope, so he wasn't being magisterial. So um, it's almost like, okay, I kind of see what you're saying, and then I also see what the other groups are saying. Again, it comes down to this question: is who do we go to settle a
Yeah.
dispute when there's no church?
Yeah, it seems to me their position is even more dire than your typical Sedevacantist because, I mean, as far as I know, they don't even have clergy, right? I mean, I think I read somewhere that they allow, in some instances, their people to go like Eastern Catholic
Yeah,
priests because they claim that they still have valid orders, even though they're Vatican II heretics, according to them. But,
yeah.
um,
Yeah, so the thing is with Eastern, since they didn't change their rights of ordination at Vatican II,
mhm,
they accept it as valid, but they'll still give the
right.
same caveat of, "Oh, if they're a heretic, don't approach them." And there's it's just crazy. You should watch. I think Michael Lofton did a video of this a while ago, going through their website, like basically their guide on how to receive the sacraments. And
No boy.
it'll be like, if the priest is a heretic, but his homily doesn't contain, or yeah, if his homily doesn't contain a heresy at any point, he doesn't impose on you, then you can receive from him. But if he mentions heresy, and in their mind, their bar for heresy is really low. Then the other one too is like, if you do have to go, you should go on a weekday mass because they don't give a homily, and it's like, so it's basically just like, oh, I didn't hear,
Right.
or I didn't hear any heresy, but I know he's a heretic. But as long as he didn't say it at that mass, it's just really, and like
Well,
they don't base it on
because
anything. And like, there's nothing in canon law that says like
no.
a heretic doesn't
Why
have a
would that
homily, you
even
can
be?
approach him. As far as I know,
Like, because it's dangerous for your soul after you've heard some sort of heresy in a homily to
yeah,
approach him to receive the sacrament. Like, I don't understand that argument. Just
yeah,
again, I'm gonna keep bringing it up, but like that sounds even more like Donatisti than
hmm
these other Sede groups. It's like, what would that even, what would that reasoning even be? At least
Well,
if you're there, might as well receive the sacrament.
hmm
right. Well, and I mean, at that point, if being in if being in communion with a heretic, right, according to them, these Eastern Catholic priests who are in communion with Rome, if that's not enough to run away, why not just go to the Orthodox Church down the street?
hmm
I'm definitely not going to hear about ecumenism because they don't play that game. I'm not going to hear
right,
about Vatican II. I'm not even going to hear about this heretic pope. I mean, it sounds like a win-win. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Yeah, it, they're pretty wild.
yeah,
And their followers too are even more
yeah.
bizarre. It
Just one more
seems.
thing on the sacraments thing. They basically say, yeah, if you can't find a heretic priest, there's no obligation. So don't go to mass.
Yeah.
You don't have to receive communion. if you commit a mortal sin, make an act of perfect contrition, aka confession of desire, which they conveniently are okay with. um,
Confession of desire.
yeah,
That's so funny.
exactly.
That's so true. That's so true. And like you think at the patristic testimony for baptism of desire and baptism, especially baptism of blood,
Mhm.
like what, like for like catechumens and stuff, like. But then you have the act of perfect contrition. It seems like that would have far less testimony,
Mhm.
at least from what I've seen.
Yeah.
I
But yeah,
wonder.
they
Sorry, not to interrupt, but it just got me thinking. Like, I wonder what they think of like the patriarch. I mean, at what point does baptism become absolutely necessary? Does it become
they
necessary
say at the
after?
from what I've understood, it's the Great Commission is when it starts
Okay,
becoming necessary. Yeah.
at least okay. I was gonna say at least they're logically consistent there, because I was
Mhm.
like, is it the crucifixion? Is it the virgin birth? Is it post? Because I mean that would have a lot of implications for
It's
all
post
of the
Vatican II.
right
Right.
all the Old Testament patriarchs are
Well, yeah,
just
and
chilling in
I was
limbo,
talking
I
to
guess, right now.
someone who took this position, and I was asking like, so was Abraham and Moses like
Right.
were they saved? And they'll say like, oh yeah, Old Covenant, but then they also said, some people believe that they were raised from the dead and baptized before they went to heaven, like that kind of thing.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
okay, I guess that squares your circle, but yeah. So there's a lot of theories about that.
Love that.
So what's interesting though, so yeah, and the Diamonds, they just released a video like a month ago, and about like it's like a video tour of their monastery, and they talk about they have a host in their tabernacle that they said was consecrated in 1996, and it got me thinking like I wonder what priest did that, and I wonder if said priest was a heretic in their mind, and if
Yeah.
so, what does that mean about are you allowed to hold that Eucharist if it was consecrated by a priest? I don't know what they would say. I do find that interesting. Yeah. But yeah, they also have. So what's interesting is I've actually had a lot of run-ins with people who take the diamond theological positions as far as baptism of desire and blood, and all of those things, but they've become disillusioned with the diamonds because of their kooky like end times prophecies, and
Mm.
their stuff about magicians and all the
Mhm.
weird stuff they believe in. They're like, I reject all that. Also, I don't see you as authoritative. I don't know if your monastery is legit, if you're real brothers, but you make a lot of good content. So they kind of like agree with them, but they've kind of distanced themselves. And there's a lot of people I've met on Twitter that kind of fall into that camp, which is
Mhm.
really interesting. Also, there are, as far as I know, two bishops that have their view on baptism. So there's Bishop Neil Webster. I don't know if you've ever heard of him,
Okay.
Christian. I
Mhm.
can't like
Yeah.
find anything about him, to be honest. Like I don't even know what he looks like. I
Yeah.
saw a video. I think Father Chikata made a video about him because he has a video recording of his consecration, and he's claiming that it's invalid. So go figure.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's this guy who's probably the most well known at the moment is Bishop Gabriel Tetherow. Um, he has an interesting history. You can look into it if you want. There's weird allegations and stuff, and he has an
Mhm.
interview where he gives his side of the story, and I have no reason to believe he's lying. But basically, he was a Novus Ordo priest, and he got caught, or yeah, basically he was watching porn on a church computer, and then that turned into a whole thing, and then there was maybe some child stuff on there, but he didn't find it, or it like or whatever it was. I'm not going to say he did any of that, but
Mhm.
either way, like that kind of makes you unfit for ministry if you're watching porn on a
Yeah.
whatever kind it is. But then, of course, he eventually comes to the conclusion, oh, I'm not even actually a priest because Sedevacantism. So he got reordained and then eventually consecrated. So he has, I believe, seminarians under him, but he takes the diamond position on baptism. But what's interesting is that the diamonds, like, you can't find anything on their website like recognizing him, acknowledging him, encouraging people to go to him, which is really interesting because like this should be like your dream come true. You finally found a non-heretic bishop. Why are
Right.
you not like excited about this? And I've heard,
Aren't they regionally pretty close to each other too?
I
Aren't
think
they
yeah, 'cause
both
the
in like
diamonds are in New York. And I think Tether was in Pennsylvania.
yeah, so I
Um,
mean,
but I think from what I've heard, and because you don't really, again, you don't see them say anything about it. I think they kind of use the whole allegations these thing as an excuse to be like, oh, he's not a pastor, he's not our shepherd because he
right.
did these things. I have a theory that the diamonds would never accept any bishop just because then they would have to be under them. They would have to
Yeah.
follow their orders. If the bishop told them, hey, don't make these weird videos, they would have to listen, and they don't want to do that. That's my theory. who knows?
You actually have just tapped into a running thread. If there's one thing that connects every single Sedevacantists group, is that implicitly, whether they will acknowledge it or not, and to varying degrees, I would argue all of them, to one degree or another, do not want to be. They don't want there to be a pope. They would prefer it to be this emergency situation that they claim it is, because then they can keep doing what they're doing,
Yeah,
and they don't have to, it doesn't blow up their whole mission. Um, yeah,
kind of gives them freedom to do it because a lot of things they justify with like state of emergency,
yeah,
epikia. Like we can kind
yeah, oh
of
yeah,
do
yeah.
whatever.
Epicea is a big one. Yep.
Yeah,
Hmm.
which is yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anything more we should say on the diamonds or anything?
Now that we mentioned their rejection of baptism of desire, I remember when I was in the process of researching, running into Vatican Catholic, and listening to a debate and just being so confused by his like insistence, like, tell me right now, are unbaptized babies in hell or not? Tell me right now. And like going over and over, and I'm like, what are you like? What's your like? Why are you going head over heels about this
Right.
like weird niche topic that
What do you
doesn't
gain
seem to have
from
anything to
this?
do?
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like,
What do
what are
you
you
gain
You're
from
just
this?
bashing this guy,
Yeah.
using all of your cross exam time to ask him
Yeah.
about unbaptized babies,
Yeah,
which has like, at least in my mind at the time, nothing to do with the debate proposition. But like
right,
now that makes sense. No baptism of desire or
right.
even,
And there's
yeah,
even you can find there's a video where they called Father Chicata and like tried to like get him to debate, and Father Chicata is like, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
What I find interesting is so the way Sedevacantists view the Feniites, like the diamonds, is the same way that a lot of us view Sedevacantists, in the sense that like I'll see these
Hmm.
debates online about baptism of desire, and like the Feniites, because that's all they think about. They normally win those debates because they're just like pounding them with papal encyclicals and like, here, look at this contradiction, like you can't believe this, and they kind of just brush off like, oh, no, the magisterium teaches like every saint taught this, whatever. And it's like they're kind of just doing the same thing that they are doing with Vatican II, as far as like, oh, look at this contradiction. Oh, look at what this teaching says. This contradicts Vatican II. And it is true that a lot of them just kind of, they're like, I'm not going to debate Feniites, and it could be because they don't want to, or because maybe I don't know. Like I just find that it's, you go down the rabbit hole into these more fringe groups, and you find that it's like, yeah, the relationship they have is just like, we don't take the other person seriously. But again, who's going to decide?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's fascinating too because part of the appeal, at least for me, converting was it's not an endless, and we talked about this earlier. It's not like an endless debate over the whole text of scripture, jumping back and forth between all these verses and going back and forth without any resolution. We have sacred tradition, we have the magisterium, we can appeal to how. Sorry, my son is like banging on some. I don't know if you guys can hear that. It's like anyways, but part of it was like, oh yeah, the meaning of the divine, or of the sacred deposit in the written word of Scripture is illuminated by the attestation of sacred tradition, and if that's not clear enough, then the magisterium can step in, settle these disputes definitively. All valid or licit questioning of the subject is kind of ended there, right? But when you don't have a magisterium, and it's just like you're pounding each other with not only sacred tradition or sacred scripture, but you're also going into
Mhm.
these papal encyclicals, bulls, and saints and stuff like that. It broadens the amount of things that you have to look into, which
Mhm.
in most circumstances can be very, very useful, right, for clarifying doctrines. But when you don't have a magisterium to step
Mhm.
in, when someone's just obfuscating and like going to all these tiny niche sections and
Yeah.
interpreting them like
Mhm.
weirdly, and
Yeah.
it can
And
get very confusing. I
and to re-
understand why people wouldn't want to
yeah.
debate them.
And to relate it back to the Protestant ecclesiology again, yeah, it's like sola scriptura, but it's sola scriptura plus magisterial documents, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's more information to work with. And yes, oftentimes magisterial documents are more perspicuous. Is that the word I'm thinking of? Than Scripture in a lot of ways, but
Hmm.
still, when you're both just fighting with different papal documents, it's the same sort of like, okay, we're both kind of looking at these things a different way. How do we
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
settle it?
Yeah.
And it's just, oh
Well,
well, I'm smarter than you is what it comes down to, right?
yeah. Well, that was part of the appeal for the Catholic Church as opposed to like the East and all the little alternatives to Eastern Orthodoxy, right? Because it's not like you have a magisterium that is able to bind the conscience of everyone universally. Like they don't meet for ecumenical councils, right? And
Hmm.
so when you're researching from a Protestant perspective, like you come to the conclusion that the East doesn't even believe in a universally binding magisterium. Like they only have sacred tradition and sacred scripture. Like they don't
Hmm.
have a magisterium. Whereas like historically, when we were in communion with each other, it's like, well, obviously, yeah, like the representatives, like the hierarchy, um, they can come together and bind all the faithful to believe something. Like obviously, there's a universally binding magisterium,
Hmm.
um, but like nowadays, it's like it's not even it doesn't even resemble that, right? So it's like they don't even have a magisterium. It's comparable to what we see in the East. It's just really bizarre,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
All right.
that's why. Sorry, I brought that up because it
Yeah.
reminded me. You have the rebaptism controversy. You
Hmm.
have the
Hmm.
controversy on
Yep.
contraception and things like that. So you can't come to a definitive conclusion on those things where it's like we've had that settled for
Hmm.
very long for a very
Right.
long time. Because
Yeah.
we have the ability, the capacity to do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Let's go deeper down the rabbit hole. We have the home aloners. So we already kind of talked about the practical home aloners, like the diamonds, where it's like, well,
Hmm.
the priests are all heretics. There's also the people where it's like, oh, I'd love to go to an SSPV chapel, but the closest one is 4 hours away. So, like, just practically,
Right.
I can't go to mass on Sunday. But then you have people like Jerry Matitix, the downfall of Jerry Matitix. Let's talk about that. But he takes a position that these bishops and priests, or I guess it would just be bishop. These bishops do not have ordinary jurisdiction. They are not sent by God, since there is no pope to send them. And his argument is that in this time of crisis, where there is no pope, we actually just can't have bishops. Um, and so we cannot. The term he uses is unauthorized shepherds. So we cannot approach them for the sacraments, even though they're valid, even if they're not heretics. They should not be doing this. They have an illegitimate ministry. But yeah, Jerry Matix is interesting because he was a Protestant convert. He was in the same seminary as Scott Hahn when they were Protestants. They both converted around the same time. He converted. He became a Catholic Answers staff apologist for a while. And this is a little known fact. He debated this guy named James White a couple times. I don't know if you guys heard about that.
Never
Was it
heard
the
of them
90s?
before. Right.
No. But at some point, I think maybe mid 2000s, I might be getting the timeline wrong, but he went from just, whatever, average Catholic. I think he was in the FSSP parish for a while. Then he went SSPX and just slowly kept going. He even had a history with the Diamond Brothers because I think he like gave a lecture or something at the monastery at some point in the past. But then eventually he got to this position where he's Sedevacantists and he's saying, no, we actually can't go to mass. And um, I think there's a few other people that take. I don't think he's the only one who takes this view. There's a few others, but I would say it's fringe within the fringe, obviously.
Hmm.
Um, and again, this what it comes back to is like when you hear him talk about this, it's like, okay, I see what you're saying. Like the points you're making, like they're internally consistent. You're making references to papal documents or whatever, and it's like, okay, I see what you're saying, yeah. But it's like again, it's like you're just adding another theory that like kind of makes sense internally, but you still have to decide like, okay, which of these groups are who should I be listening to?
The whole home aloner kind of mentality is interesting because it's not an exclusively Sedevacantist phenomenon. I mean, you can make the argument one way or another in terms of how in communion the Society of St. Pius X is.
Mhm.
I tend to be more of a hardliner, frankly, against them, and I have my reasons for that. But they present the same arguments as home aloners,
Mhm.
and Sedevacantists who say that if you can't go to mass, generally Sedevacantists will say if you're in Metro Orlando, right, and there's really no legit Sedevacantist group near us, actually there's one within an hour, but if for some reason you can't travel, right? Say you're in rural Florida, you're in the Everglades, you're in a hut in the Everglades, and you have to ride your gator to get into town. You as we all do. Um, your option is to move. That's what you should do. That's what they all say. But if you can't do that, and with the Matatux kind of mentality, kind of takes it to its logical conclusion. If you can't do that, or if you simply won't do that because there are no valid bishops, which means there's no valid priests, so on and so forth, then, well, the divine law is simply to consecrate the Lord's day. It doesn't mean you have to do that with the sacraments. And you get this a lot with Sedevacantists. The sacraments are not necessary for salvation. Um, they are vehicles for salvation that help us in our fallen sinful nature, but they are not absolutely necessary. You do not need the Mass to get to heaven, which is true. I mean, they're not wrong when they say that. Um, but that's their way of justifying the fact that if you can't move to Cincinnati, or you can't move to Reading, Pennsylvania, or to Omaha, or to wherever these massive, or to St. Mary's, Kansas, then just stay inside and say your rosary, or pray the mass from your pre-55 breviary. Um, and that just seems to me to be incredibly problematic, because I mean, I again, they're right when they say that you don't need the sacraments to get to heaven, or even to attain sanctity. I mean, if you think of Anthony of the Desert, right,
Mhm.
homeboy, left for years, and he's holier than all of us. um, but so it's certainly possible, but I think it's just such a very terrifying way to view the faith and to view Christ's promise to us. I
Mhm.
mean, something, if the arc of salvation involves this intense apostasy in which it is all completely wiped away in an instant in Italy, by some guys in pointy hats, in the
Mhm.
70s, that's not great. That's not great, and
Right.
maybe the argument held water back then because they were waiting for Russia to bomb us and for the second coming to happen, next Tuesday.
Mhm.
But it's been 50 years, guys. I mean, come on. So,
Yep. Yep.
Because all the members of the hierarchy just jumped off the ark, and I'm the only one left here.
right,
So
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that Home Alone. Anyways, all that was to say was that Home Alone mentality is not exclusive to just Sedevacantism, and I
Right.
mentioned society because they're kind of the quasi bridge between
Mhm.
communion and full out non-communion with the Catholic
Right.
Church, institutional church. And I just, anyone who thinks that you can listen to what Father so and so says on the SSPX USA YouTube channel, and that having any merit, I
Mhm.
think is you're accepting an argument that is inconsistent with where you're staying. If you don't have to go to St. Patrick's down the street because you don't like the music and you're tired of hearing a tambourine and clapping for the choir at the end of mass,
Mhm.
um, then why even acknowledge that as being a valid form of Catholicism at all?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, we could do a whole stream on the SSPX. Maybe we should do that sometime. That'd be interesting.
oh man, don't
'Cause
get me
it is kind
started.
of the bridge between the church and Sedevacantism in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
yeah. Well, I mean, think of all the clergy we've talked about: Father Jenkins, Father Chicada, Bishop Dolan, Clarence Kelly, even some that we didn't mention. All have direct ties to the Society of
mhm.
Saint Pius X. Some of them are founding members of the Society of Saint Pius X. So
Yeah.
it's just one logical conclusion. That's
Yeah.
all it is.
And my hot take is that Sedevacantists are more consistent and honest because
Hmm.
the
Oh
idea
yeah,
of like, oh, there's a pope, but we're gonna
yeah,
just like resist him, or yeah, there was a council, but it had heresy. Whereas the Sedevacantists are like,
yeah.
no, he's not the pope. That's why we don't listen to him. And Vatican II wasn't a council. That's why we don't accept it. It's like kind of makes a little more
so
sense.
This is what.
so SSPX, they're not technically
No,
Sedevacantists, but it's like people in there might not believe that the Pope is
There
the
are
Pope,
I'm sure
there.
all
or
the priests do, and they all say they mention him in the canon. I have no reason to believe they don't, but
Mhm.
they actively tell you to resist him. So,
Yeah, there are certainly cryptos among the faithful and the clergy for sure. Yeah, you're 100% right though, Seth, when you say that the Sedes are more consistent and intellectually honest in their position. And this was actually a big sticking point in the early days of American Sedevacantism and European Sedevacantism, for that matter, was the position of recognize and resist.
Hmm.
One, can we hold it and still be Catholic? And eventually, well, I mean, that was really a big position: is can you be a Catholic and recognize the Pope and resist him? The Sedevacantists, the people who ultimately denied the legitimacy of Vatican Council II and the post-conciliar popes, ultimately took the position that no, you cannot. And frankly, I think they're
Hmm.
correct in that position. They're just wrong in claiming that Vatican II teaches heresy.
Yeah.
So the SSPX is like the gateway drug
Oh
to
yeah, yeah.
Sedevacantism, like
It's that.
independent fundamentalist Baptist is like the gateway drug to like Nestorianism. Is that like kind of the
Yeah.
comparison?
Yeah, it's that first step in the dare promise that
Hmm.
the dare oath we all took in third grade. It's
Yeah.
that first joint you roll
What
up.
what I will say, and maybe to say a nice thing about the SSPX, is that even though they're kind of playing with this cognitive dissonance within themselves, they're the ones who go after the Sedevacantists in a lot of ways. They're very clear, like we're not going to cross this line, right? So like
Yeah.
John Salza, I know he's not
Hmm.
SSPX anymore. He's kind of he got red pilled on that, but he when he wrote his book True or False Pope, which is like the best, most comprehensive book on this topic that's out there. He was a member of society, or he attended. I know he's not a member because he's a layperson,
Right.
but um, yeah, it seems like they're very clear. Like this is a line we're not going to cross, and they're very good at defending that. So I'll give them props to that. And like part of the reason the Castman Diamond debate didn't go very well is because Castman is an SSPX guy, and props to him. He's like still very strongly like, no, I don't believe that. I'll defend that. But it kind of went against him because he at different points he almost had to admit like, yeah, Pope Francis is a heretic, but he's still the Pope. It's
Hmm.
like,
Yeah.
or Vatican II contains heresy. Yeah, you
Like
did.
Castman. Oh, that guy. That was on
Yeah.
Pints, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 I was bitterly disappointed before that debate even started. When I saw who the interlocutors were, I knew it was going to be a nightmare because
Mhm.
um I think I even did a video on this.
That's how I found
I
your channel originally. That
Oh
was the first
really?
video I saw. Yeah, yeah.
I try to keep my channel. I never post. I think the last time I posted was like 6 months ago because my channel's so. I try to keep it niche within the ordinary Anglican spirituality. This is who I am. This is what I want to talk about. This is what I want to try and educate people on.
Mhm.
But that was one thing where I was like, I gotta talk about this because
Yeah.
um before it even started, I was like, you have an SSPX recognizing resistor going up against a Sedevacantist Feniite. Like, both parties are being so poorly represented right now.
Yeah.
I was like, there's like 9 different people that would have better represented the Catholic Church, and there's like 20 different people that could have represented Sedevacantism way
Mhm.
better. Um, yeah, that debate, I'm pretty. I have some pretty strong feelings about
Yeah.
that debate. And I don't hold anyone accountable. Like, I'm not saying that
Oh,
against
sure. Yeah.
Matt. Or I love Pint. I mean, Pints I think is the Catholic channel. Um, but yeah, that's one where that was a swing and a miss. That was a
Yeah.
swing and a miss.
Just it's so fascinating to me, especially I'm in an ecumenical councils course at the moment, and just like to say that an ecumenical council, binding the consciences of at least requiring the submission of intellect and will
Hmm.
from all the faithful, to say that it teaches heresy. I don't know, it kind of goes back to the
Mhm.
protection of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
If you say that an ecumenical council, when the bishops and the pope come together to teach something, um, that it's not protected from at least heresy, then where does that lead? I can see how a lot of people can go to Sedevacantists
Hmm.
and just say, yeah, Vatican II teaches heresy. That's why it's not an ecumenical council, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this is an interesting point that Gen Z Catholic made in his. I don't know if you guys watched his documentary on Sedevacantism. It's really good.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's how he and I first got talking. Was I watched it, like it just popped up in my recommended, like I think 20 minutes after he posted it. So I
Oh
immediately
wow.
threw it on and started listening to it. And it was pretty good. Especially it was all really good, but particularly like the first like third of it,
Mm.
first third to 2/3. his history
Mm.
of the movement and just how varied it is, and all kind of the key players and how they're all intertwined are
Yeah.
like it's very well done. It's
Yeah.
very well done.
But I was gonna say what was interesting is he made a point. I'm gonna butcher how he phrased it, but like it's unclear. Do the Sedevacantists say Vatican II was an invalid council because it was promulgated by heretics, or did they become heretics when it was like a chicken and egg kind of thing? Like,
Yeah,
was it the council that was heretical because they were all already heretics and invalid, or is it the act of promulgating the council that made them heretics? It's like it's a little bit
yeah.
unclear what they would say.
And again, it's varied because Sedevacantism is not monolithic, which is a good indicator to the fact that it is not. I I hate to say that. I hate to phrase it this way, but I'm going to. It's a good indicator that it is not Catholic, and I don't mean that to say that Catholicism is monolithic, because obviously it's not. Every facet of the faith is is pretty varied, and that's what Catholic means, right? It's universal, and it's meant to be able to fit all the different facets of our lives and apply to us differently. But at the end of the day, keep us on the same theological kind of orthodox playing field. Um, but yeah, no, I mean that's a good point. The whole chicken and the egg thing. I mean, a lot of Sedevacantists, your kind of heavy hitters, claim that all this happened, that they became heretics prior to Vatican II, and they instituted Vatican II particularly to destroy the church. It's
Mhm.
essentially a Freemason kind of conspiracy. They
Mhm.
basically that the modernists came in, held this council with the intention of destroying the church to create this one world religion. And that's not my words. Those are the words of, again, heavy hitters like
Mhm.
Chikata, Sanborn, Dolan. I mean, and you can read their work and listen to their podcasts and their videos, and they say the very same thing.
Mhm.
My argument against that, my question is, well, okay, you're saying that seminaries today are modernist and heretical, and they're producing modernists and heretics. But then you're saying that this all started when modernists and heretics infiltrated the church. Where would these where were these modernists and heretics trained in?
Mhm.
Oh, you mean seminaries in the 30s? Okay, yeah. So you're telling me that that wasn't good enough, which means their
Mhm.
professors weren't, and it keeps walking back, and it just they can't they can't give you
Yeah,
this one explanation.
and even when you look at like Pius XII, all of the bishops and cardinals that surrounded him,
Mhm.
according to this theory, is as soon as a few years later they were all heretics because they started celebrating the new mass and they accepted Vatican II. So it's like, were they already modernists, but they weren't? They hadn't done anything publicly heretical until then. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a lot of speculation that has to go on there.
People like Chikata make the argument that these are his words again, the rats were in the walls even before the pontificate of Pius XII. And he points to things like the 55 revision
Hmm.
of the Missal,
Yeah.
of the Holy Week, ceremonies, which is a whole other thing. But then you really can't, again, you can't start with Pius. It's like saying that the East West Schism was in 1054. You
Right.
can't say that with a straight face. You just can't. You have to. It keeps inching back and forth. And it's the same with Sedevacantism. If you have an
Mhm.
issue with Pius XII, you have to have an issue with Pius XI, even Benedict XV, and even Leo XIII, and it keeps going. And even Pius X, you have Pius. You've had there's Sanborn criticizing and um, making criticisms and critiques of Pius X
Yeah.
and his.
Even though he's known as the one who like went against modernism, right? That's
Yeah, seriously, and against some of his works, even though, again, like you said, he's kind of the ultimate crusader and the bulwark of what they would consider to be, capital T tradition and capital C Catholicism. The goalposts constantly have to be moving back with
yeah.
settlecontism, which is a sign of its inconsistency.
Well, that's a great transition to the groups that do take the vacancy back prior to 1958.
Oh
Let's
God.
Because the
go.
vast
Here
majority of
we
these groups
go.
all say Pius XII is the last pope. They're very consistent on that because obviously John the 23rd opened the Second Vatican Council.
Hmm.
But then we have a group like Mary's Little Remnant. So this is a group run by a man named Richard Ibrani. I hope I'm pronouncing that
Yeah.
right. He actually used to be a brother at the monastery, Most Holy Family
Yeah.
Monastery, back before they were Sedevacantists, because they were not always Sedevacantists. In fact, you can find this video again. It's hard to find, but people have it, of Michael Diamond giving this sort of lecture about, oh, it's this theory of Sedevacantism, and here's why it's false. But this guy Richard Abrani, he was convinced of Sedevacantism, and he was, giving out material. He was, Peter and Michael. He was like trying to tell them about it. He was sending it to, their supporters and everything. And this turned into, a big thing. And Michael like basically expelled him, saying, you need to leave. Of course, eventually they come to believe that, which is kind of ironic. But this guy started his own group called Mary's Little Remnant, and he says we have not had a pope since, drumroll, 1130 A.D., which is just shortly after the official.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah. Which is only a century after that formal schism we talked about with the East and West, which is really interesting. Yeah, he says every council says, he has this. You can find this document on his website. The heresies of the Council of Trent. He believes, Aquinas was
Heresies of Aquinas. Yeah.
Yeah, he says Aquinas is a heretic who's in hell because he's just crazy stuff. And what's interesting about this again is
we're blowing his mind right now. Look at
you've never heard
like,
of this?
What? How can you even believe that?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? Like,
and he has a following. I mean, it's not a big following, but they have these videos of them doing these marches in their little town, and there's like 20 people, which honestly is a lot. Yeah.
Wow.
So what's interesting about this group is that all they're doing is taking the same logic. They're finding supposed contradictions in, the Council of Trent and prior teaching, or finding statements about popes that they think are heretical, and they're just moving back. And I guess he did research on every pope, and then he finally stopped it at, I think, Innocent II would have been the last one. It's like, okay, he was good, and everyone before him was good. So, but
which is interesting because, sorry to interrupt you, but Innocent II, I don't know if it's his immediate predecessor, but eventually one of his predecessors, Innocent III, is a big name with kind of standard Sedevacantists, because he I don't remember if it was in an encyclical or a bull. He basically was the first to formulate that the Pope, if he falls into error, he's already judged. In other words, he was kind of the first, not the first, but he set this very high standard initially that Sedevacantists claim sets precedent for why it's so easy to fall in and out of the papacy, frankly. One day, to use their phraseology, one day Francis can be a heretic. The next day he can repent. He can be pope for 20 minutes. And as soon as he falls back into heresy, he's not pope again,
Yeah. If I remember correctly, it's with this specific group, it's not even so much that they like went to each pope and found a heretical statement. They base it off like sins of omission. And I think one of them is actually, if I remember, let me double check on this. I think it has to do with like nude artwork in churches or something.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was. And it was basically saying like the desecration of churches, and by sin of omission, because no pope like quashed that completely, that makes him heretic, which is like, it's just so funny. It's like, that's like the thing that can make you lose your office, is like you didn't shut down all the churches that had nude artwork in it. It's just very, and it's totally arbitrary on what they can decide is worthy of that and what's not, right?
Yeah, their website is wild because, again, and you can read all their documents, and it's like you said, it's just the heresies of Thomas Aquinas, the heresies of Bonaventure, the heresy. I mean, all the Dominic of Dominic. It's crazy. It's like heresies of Trent, heresies of Vatican I. It's all there. It's all there.
Yeah. So it says on this document they have called "No Pope since Innocent II and no Catholic theologian since 1250." But he's saying all of these apostate anti-popes become so for supporting or allowing the following crimes or criminals. Supporting the crime or criminals means they favored or promoted the crimes or criminals. Allowing the crimes, they did not sufficiently condemn the crime. So it's like, it's just such a loose bar of like, they just didn't do enough to stop the supposed crime. But yeah, it's a fun website, and they have a lot of documents on there. I have a video. There's a because there's this audio of him talking about his time at the monastery, and like, who knows if any of it's true, but it's funny. But me and a friend of mine were reacting to it and just having some fun with that. So you can find some stuff on them, but it's extremely fringe.
Yeah.
So let's see, what else do we have here. I guess another thing, I don't even know what to call them, but like I guess just independent chapels. So as far as there's one Sedevacantist chapel in my immediate area, and as far as I know, it's not connected to any of these priestly groups.
Hmm.
I think theologically they're probably the same, but it's kind of just like a they're kind of just independent. I don't know if they answer to a bishop. I assume they have valid orders, um, but I wonder how they justify their mission. I don't know.
Yeah, there's as big a metro area as Orlando is, and as big a set of a contest presence there is in Florida. In the immediate Orlando area, like my nearest set of a contest chapel is actually an independent chapel, and they have their own resident bishop and their own priests, and they have a congregation of like 60 people, and they do their thing. I've tried contacting them just to get their take on things.
Mhm.
And they're very cryptic, and they ultimately wanted me to go and talk to them, and I'm like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Like, you can respond to my email, or you cannot. Concerning mission, though, this is something that a lot of Sedevacantists had to deal with in the beginning. Um, because how do you square this,
Mhm.
and a lot of them dealt with this problem before they were set of a contest. So, like, for example, Sanborn, Chicada, those folks dealt with it when they were in the Society of St. Pius X, because it's like, all right, I've been ordained, I'm now a Catholic priest, I'm being in the society, I'm under the authority of a bishop, but we are not under canonical mission. We are not given a direct mission from Rome. We're going to a place that the Pope condemns, and we're doing things that the Pope condemns. How do we handle this? What do
Mhm.
we do here? And this kind of goes back to the wider SSPX problem. The only solution to that is, well, you must not submit to him. Well, if he's the Pope, you have to. But what if he's not the Pope? You know, how can we make that work out? How can we parse this out theologically and reach that conclusion?
Mhm.
And so that's where they then come to the conclusion, and they invoke the principle of epikeia, which you mentioned prior,
Mhm.
which is this theological position, which is true and valid, that um, in extraneous and kind of extenuating circumstances, a priest or a prelate or a Catholic individual may act in a way which may not be canonically licit, but necessary given the
Mhm.
situation. Licit might not be the best word, but typical is
Mhm.
probably the best word to use. A good way to think of this is, if you're a Franciscan, right? You take a vow of poverty, and you are in a bookstore, and there's a book there that your chapel needs, right? But you can't contact your immediate superior, um, because whatever, you don't have a phone because you're a
Mhm.
Franciscan. um, and but your chap, you need a new missal, or you need a new pontifical because a bishop's going to visit and he needs, whatever. You need this, and it's in front of you. Well, typically when you'd have to make a purchase, you'd have to contact your superior, get a direct approval, and this, that, and the other. But in that situation, the Franciscan can say, I know for a fact that we need this for a valid reason. I'm invoking the principle of epikeia. I am not going against my vow of obedience or poverty, by purchasing this book specifically for this institute.
Mhm.
Um, so most independent chapels will
Mhm.
invoke the principle of epikeia, um, to justify what they do. Same with bishops; they invoke these men who are consecrated, these priests who are consecrated bishops, invoke that principle as a way of justifying the fact that they are receiving episcopal consecration, even though canon law requires that you get the okay to be consecrated a bishop from the Pope. Um, they circumvent that by simply invoking the fact that we're in a state of emergency, we're in a state of necessity, the people need sacraments, the church needs priests, so I'm gonna have hands laid on me so I can continue the priesthood.
Right. Yeah, and a good example of this, actually, maybe more relevant, would be because Pope John Paul II had to do this in a time of persecution, right, where he did consecrate bishops.
Yeah, well, he himself was clandestinely ordained. The seminary he went to in Krakow was under persecution,
Mhm.
I believe by the Nazis. I don't know, I can't remember. I read it bio on him not too long ago. I can't remember if it was World War One or World War Two. I'm pretty sure it's World War Two though. The seminary had to operate in secret, and he was ordained essentially in like a room no bigger than the room I'm in now, because it was illegal to function as a Catholic cleric at the time. So yeah, it has precedent. And same with the Eastern churches when they were persecuted under the Soviet regimes. They had to continue as they could, or even the Chinese church right now, the underground church, they have to operate as they can, and sometimes that means not following canon law to the letter. But instead of a contest, in this instance, it would not apply because, again, the Petrine See is not vacant. In fact, in fact. So.
It's so fascinating, just the discussion of mission. It reminds me of St. Francis de Sales and his arguments against Protestants. And there's this concept of mediate and immediate, and ordinary and extraordinary mission. And so an example of obviously extraordinary and immediate mission is Christ's ordaining and commissioning the apostles and giving them that authority. And what's associated with their preaching as being given extraordinary mission from God directly to preach, especially something new, but start this new movement, kind of spearhead it, were miracles, prophecy, like healing and stuff like that. That's always associated throughout all of salvation history with these signs of credibility that would authenticate that extraordinary immediate ministry. And so when there's this drastic change that's supposedly happening in the church, where all of the hierarchy falls away, and it's like there's no pope, especially more of the extreme forms of Sedevacantism, you would expect that they would advocate, or they would invoke some sort of extreme immediate mission from God, that they've received some sort of revelation. And if this were truly the way in which God has desired to I suppose govern his church, and his church to operate in this new time with this extraordinary circumstance, to give this extraordinary credibility to the preaching of these various Sedevacantist groups, or a particular Sedevacantist group. But it's like, I don't see them advocating for that. They would just advocate, we have ordinary mission, but ordinary mission is associated with being in communion with your bishop, who's received that ordinary mission immediately, not immediately. So that immediate mission is passed down through apostolic succession, and that's why being in communion with your bishop, who's in communion with the Pope, is so necessary for being a part of the Catholic Church. And so that's why Sedevacantism is again, there's another kind of correlation with the Protestant ecclesiology, is they won't give reasons why they have this extraordinary mission from God, and the times when they would try to prove it by some sort of prophecy, it would horribly backfire. And there's actually a lot of I suppose the veracity of these claims of like anti motives of credibility against like Luther and the Reformers. They would give these stories about, like, let's say Luther's death, and Luther dies, and they're supposedly like transporting his body, and they say that he was put into this casket that's supposedly like air sealed, airtight. They put all this the incense and stuff like that to stop the body from smelling, but the smell of his dead body was so putrid that it leaked through the casket and no one could carry it. And it's like these anti-motives of credibility that the Catholic reformers would bring up and be like, you should have these extraordinary, if you're advocating for this extraordinary mission from God, you should be able to authenticate that ministry using these motives of credibility that God has always given. But in actuality, there's false prophecies, and there's anti-motives. There's things that would suggest that your mission wasn't mediate or immediate or authentic or
Yeah.
licit in any way, shape, or form.
That's a really good take, and kind of, again, another connection that you have between Sedevacantism and Protestantism in terms of their ecclesiology. I find that interesting because in Sedevacantist, you have this sort of this mentality of, well, as long as my orders are valid, I'm good to go. I'm kosher, right? That's the standard. And I mean, there's some validity behind that, right? If you're gonna be, um, if you're gonna seek ordination from a bishop whose orders are dubious, I mean, I would not want to be a priest, standing at an altar, not really being sure if what I'm trying to do is actually happening. Um, but because of that mentality of just validity, and not worrying about lyceity, they skip over that, like you said, that connection of immediate um, mission and jurisdiction and intention that is passed on through apostolic succession. And there's a certain sense to where, amongst that of a contest, you have this argument of, kind of order, whole lines of holy orders that have been sullied through because of various men, because of men like Schuckardt. Some people would say Archbishop Took, all these other people, who were not good bishops, and therefore any priest or bishop that has been ordained or consecrated by them, you shouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But it seems to me they're kind of asking the wrong question, because valid is valid, whether it's sullied or not, whatever that means. What's really important is the mediacy of that of that mission. Is that pure? Because that ultimately is kind of one of the, I mean, it's validity is as well, but that mediacy, that mission, has to be pure if it comes from Christ, right? As soon as there's any sully in that jurisdiction, in that mission, you can, it seems to me, you can completely point to that and say, well, this is not of Christ, and therefore this is not of the church, and I want nothing to do with this. It doesn't matter how valid your orders are. um, the old Catholics, still to this day, some of them have valid orders,
Hmm.
and they even recognize, as they include the name of the Bishop of Rome in their canon. But man, I don't think anyone would argue that they have any mediacy or any legitimate mission. Which ultimately is why it's not good enough to go to them, because again, that might be Jesus on the altar, but yet they're not operating within the bounds of his church.
My friends, I've run out of time, sadly.
We do have the anti popes to talk about real quick.
No, dude. No, the people we were trying to get to debate each
Because
other.
you had a run in with Pope Boniface on Twitter, right?
Oh my goodness, dude. He found my Twitter and he was just blasting me. I was like, what the heck, dude?
Yeah.
Come on
So
now.
basically, there's two groups of modern anti popes. There's the conclavists and the assumers, I call them. So the conclavists would be like Pope Michael, who got a few friends and family in a thrift store, and they elected him pope. Then there's now Pope Michael II, who I guess was a follower of his, who's now taken over as pope. And then there's like the Palmarian Church, which is like their own whole thing.
Yeah.
Uh, then you have this Pope Boniface X guy, who's basically saying we can't have a conclave because there are no valid cardinals or whatever, or non-heretic cardinals, but we need a pope. So it's the first man to accept it becomes pope, is basically his theory,
Mhm.
and that's him. And I asked him on Twitter. He said he became the pope in 2008, which still leaves a 50-year vacancy, which I find interesting. It's like his whole reason for why he can become pope is that Vatican I says we need perpetual successors, so I had to do it. It's like, so a 50-year vacancy is fine, but suddenly it's like that demands you to become it. But it's funny. There's also this other guy, Pope Jacobus the 1st, who I
Yeah.
think his website doesn't have as much information, but I think he kind of goes off the same principle. So do
Yeah,
these two like do they have
from
beef?
what I gathered, he basically told me was that he was the only person. He said, I was freed and kept from the errors of heresy, which made me the pope. Which is like,
He was the
what?
only one.
Yeah.
Oh
Hmm.
gosh.
So
Um, but yeah, it's like I've been trying to get these popes to debate each other, and it just can't happen. I tried to ask
Yeah.
Pope Boniface X will do it, and then I
No face reveal though. No face reveal.
exactly. Well, I contacted Pope Michael II on Facebook, and it was funny because he responded in like 30 seconds, which was like, wow, I didn't know I had direct access to the Pope so easily.
I'm
Um,
friends with Michael II, and I was friends with Michael the First on Facebook.
really, that's funny.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
But I tried to ask him like, will you debate Boniface? And he's like, no, he can't be taken seriously. It's like, look in the mirror. Then he's also the thing is with Pope Boniface X is he's never shown his face, and that's like one of the things
Yeah.
that a lot of people troll him on is like, show me your face. Like, how do I know you're not a woman or like
Mhm.
whatever? And he's like, I don't have to do that.
Oh, what's that thing? He's the Black Pope. Is that the like the secret
It could
like
be, yeah, but I don't know.
undercover Pope? Who's it?
He might lose a couple followers if that's true.
Yeah, yeah, right.
No. But yeah, it's like all these popes. It's like I can't even imagine like picking one of these to follow.
Yeah.
And that's kind of maybe a good way to wrap up the video is like there are so many like if you're discouraged by the state of the church, maybe something Pope Francis said and rubbed you the wrong way, or Vatican II or something, and you're like kind of considering sedevacantism, like how are you going to choose which flavor, which denomination, dare I say, to go to?
Yeah.
Um, it's not entirely clear. Like, yeah, you might be inclined towards one. You might think one has better arguments, but then you're kind of relying again on your own intellect.
The right of private judgment.
Exactly.
Mhm.
It's like Protestants choosing a church. It goes back to that. I don't think it's clear. Like, if I were convinced of sedevacantism, I don't actually know which of these I would choose. Like, honestly, I'd probably like,
I'd probably be a Baptist.
yeah, exactly. It'd probably be easier to just become like Orthodox at that point, But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. That's kind of what I want the takeaway from the video to be is like this is not if you're convinced of this, like that doesn't solve the problem. It actually creates more problems than it solves, in my opinion.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the reason I started when I first started talking, I said that I was never a card carrying sedevacantist. Even though I've spent more time than I care to admit studying them and reading their literature and stuff. Ultimately, the best arguments against sedevacantism were the sedevacantists themselves. It wasn't Michael Lofton, it wasn't Matt Fradd, it wasn't Jimmy Akin, it wasn't Robert Fastigi. It was me taking a look at all of them and just seeing all the constant same issues and the points that they could not deal with and answer. They could tell me about material popes and formal popes and cardinal electors and this, that, and the other, and modernists and the history of this, that, and the other. But ultimately, they can't check all the boxes of theological consistency and
Mm-hmm.
orthodoxy. And at the end of the day, if they can't do that, then it very obviously is not of the church, and it is not. Moreover, it is not of Christ. Um, and any issues I may have had with the church and the hierarchy or whatnot at any given point were purely personal things that I just had to deal with, and that frankly were pretty easy to deal with through prayer and reading scripture. So that's
Yeah,
probably my closing statements on that.
yeah. Kyle Whittington said it best when he said, "I'm not smart enough to become a sedevacantist."
That's really good.
Going
I
with
thought
your
it was
meme.
Protestant, but I guess it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, all I was gonna say is our church retains the proper name of Catholic, and it was good enough for Saint Augustine, so it's good enough for me. So
Amen,
there we
brother.
go.
Amen.
Amen, brother.
All right, well that's all we have for you today, guys. Make sure you subscribe. I'll have the links to both these channels down here. Make sure you subscribe to them. Yeah, see you next time.
Peace.
All right.